Senator Ludlam.
Thanks very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I thank all senators for engaging in the debate in the largely respectful way in which it's been conducted. I want to just add my comments to those of others who have spoken. I think it was Senator Fawcett actually who pointed out that this is not the first time that this bill has been before this chamber. In fact, it's unfinished business, in my view, to our institutional architecture that will sit on the table in this place until some form of an entity such as that which we're discussing has been implemented. I think the positions of the political parties are now reasonably clear. Liberal and National senators have spoken out, I think, reasonably clearly. They don't want a national ICAC or some form of national integrity commissioner. They're just not interested in it, and we heard a range of arguments put around this morning as to why. Labor appears to be open to the idea as long as nobody actually proceeds to set one up, which is reasonably consistent, I guess, with the way that they've operated around these issues in the past. I would like to point out, I guess, maybe the difficulty for us in here in this fishbowl, having this argument around political entitlements and our use of them as MPs and how that grades from appropriate use of entitlements, some of them substantial, through to inappropriate or grey area uses, through to brazenly inappropriate uses of parliamentary entitlements, all the way out the other side to what we would understand as corruption. And the bill that's before us attempts, I guess, to deal in a number of ways with all of those different tiers of activity. I want to quote someone who I don't think I've quoted in this place before, Nicholas Greiner, the former Premier of New South Wales. And I went back and looked at a little bit of the history of how the state anti-corruption bodies were set up, but principally the circumstances in which they arose. And in general, they arose in the midst of appalling corruption scandals within each of those states, whether it be Queensland or New South Wales that I've been reading a little bit about this morning, or my own home state of Western Australia. This is what Mr Greiner said in May 1988 when they were initiating the ICAC bill in the New South Wales Parliament. He said the following: "Nothing is more destructive of democracy than a situation where people lack confidence in those administrators that stand in a position of public trust. If a liberal and democratic society is to flourish, we need to ensure that the credibility of public institutions is restored and safeguarded, and that community confidence in the integrity of public administration is preserved and justified." Quite strong words. Now, would not normally wander in here quoting coalition state premiers, but when you look at the context in which that bill was introduced, you get a little way into his second reading speech. This is the backdrop against which that entity was set up. He says the following: "In recent years in New South Wales we have seen," and he goes on to list, "a Minister of the Crown jailed for bribery, an inquiry into a second and indeed a third former minister for alleged corruption, the former Chief Stipendiary Magistrate jailed for perverting the course of justice, a former Commissioner of Police in the courts on a criminal charge, the former Deputy Commissioner for Police charged with bribery, a series of investigations and court cases involving judicial figures including a High Court judge, and a disturbing number of dismissals, retirements and convictions of senior police officers for offences involving corrupt conduct." Now, what we saw and what I found quite instructive and interesting in listening particularly to coalition contributions this morning has been, Senator Fawcett did this actually quite carefully. He went through and listed all the different Commonwealth entities and checks and balances and accountability agencies that exist to keep a check on different parts of the Commonwealth machinery, if you like. He spoke a little bit about ASIO and ASIS. He spoke about the Federal Police, which I'll get back to in a second, and the law enforcement community more generally. And effectively, then he even talked about overseas anti-corruption. He talked about state and territory bodies. Everybody except us. And I was waiting for the punchline where he was going to use that to somehow justify the fact that no such body that should therefore apply to this place, and there was no punchline. Then he sat down and didn't actually come to the point that I thought he'd have been trying to make, and it was quite a well-constructed speech, that everybody else has some form of anti-corruption watchdog looking over the shoulder with a certain amount of powers, except this place. But then he sat down, and that was the end of his speech. And I thought that was actually kind of fascinating. Senator Canavan just floated right off the deep end and started comparing it to, the Spanish Inquisition or stuff that was going on in the Middle Ages, and turned it into a human rights argument that everybody else should have some kind of anti-corruption watchdog looking over them, except federal parliamentarians, because what about our human rights? Be funny if this wasn't the same guy who'd willfully voted for mandatory data retention for the entire population, for extraordinarily coercive powers to be placed over the media. The ability of ASIO to snoop on practically the entire internet off the back of a single warrant is now considering allowing a handful of select Immigration Department bureaucrats to revoke people's citizenship unilaterally. Human rights, obviously, they can be disposed of for other people, but don't trespass on Senator Canavan's human rights. He doesn't need an anti-corruption watchdog looking over his shoulder. An extraordinary contribution. You never quite lose. It actually is Senator McDonald, and I thank you for letting me proceed in silence. This is not often your character so far this morning. It's been very, very good of you. Nonetheless, Senator Canavan's comments are on the record. He can speak for himself, and that's fine. But I want to bring to the attention of the Chamber the following: Section 135.2 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code, which pertains to obtaining a financial advantage that people are not entitled to receive. That is the section of the Commonwealth Criminal Code that Centrelink uses to prosecute people for wrongfully claiming their welfare allowances and entitlements. Roughly, according to what I looked up this morning, roughly 10 a day, 10 prosecutions a day, somewhere around the country. That's what happens if you are in improper receipt of your welfare entitlements for people who are living right on the edge of poverty, or in fact well below the poverty line. Politicians, on the other hand, can sail along on baseline salaries starting at around $200,000 a year. We make a mistake in here. No, the federal police doesn't move prosecutions under that section of the Criminal Code. We're allowed to, in some cases for years, leave it lying under the carpet, and then you can come forward and say, oops, I'm sorry, I'm going to repay that. Or we see the way that the former disgraced Speaker of the other place handled it, kind of dug in bitterly until it was obvious to everyone in the country except her and the Prime Minister that, that flying a chopper into a Liberal Party fundraiser and emerging like some kind of Bond villain is so far outside entitlements that it doesn't pass any kind of test that you would want to put on it. But the gargantuan double standard that applies appears to be invisible to everyone inside this building. But I can honestly say it's really highly visible to everybody outside. And maybe it's like asking a fish to notice water. Maybe it's just really difficult because it's what we swim in here. And that sense of cocooning and isolation that occurs in this building that I think touches all of us in some ways, that we're in here for weeks at a time and then you fly home and you kind of reconnect with the rest of the world and with the real world. That isolation, I think, that distances us and is why maybe there's this denial, which I think we should really call out this morning, of politicians from the Liberal, National and Labor parties saying, we don't need something like this to apply to us. The states and territories are different. The police forces are different. Everybody, the public sector, they're different. We're above all of that. We're above reproach. There's no evidence. The reason that there's no evidence of corruption at that high level of Commonwealth politics is that nobody is charged with looking for it and finding it. Is that gap in the institutional architecture that people have been quite happy to gloss over and pretend we don't need this morning is precisely the problem. Some senators, probably inadvertently, I'm assuming good faith on this, clearly don't understand what the bill does, so I just want to come to what the actual proposal is. The proposal is for a National Integrity Commission, and it has three main offices, and this is some confusion that was expressed, I think, by Senator Fawcett this morning. The idea is that the agency or the entity has three limbs. One of them is to absorb the existing Commonwealth Law Enforcement Integrity Commissioner. So it's not that we're proposing to establish a new Law Enforcement Intelligence Integrity Office. It's to absorb the existing functions and operations of that body. That is charged with investigating alleged corruption in the AFP and the Australian Crimes Commission. And a lot of those powers that are based on the Law Enforcement Integrity Commissioner Act of 2006 we don't really propose to modify. But the two new limbs that would come into being would be the National Integrity Commission, which is modelled reasonably closely on the New South Wales ICAC, which has been devastatingly effective at going through and rooting out the unthinkable corruption that was rotting away at the hearts of the Liberal National Party in New South Wales and the Labor Party in New South Wales. So that is one limb, that is the national ICAC. And I think maybe it does make sense in your party rooms when you're working out your tactics to say, we're above all that, there's simply no evidence of any such thing. Are we going to wait for the kind of gruesome corruption scandals that disfigured politics in the states, that led to the establishment of those anti-corruption bodies? Do we have to wait until it's just rotting out there in plain sight? Or could we move preemptively to set up such a body to begin to restore public trust and confidence in the institution in which we hold so much trust in here? The third limb, which I guess is timely, somebody, I forget whose contribution it was, says, oh, how gross of the Greens to come in here off the wake of a hideous parliamentary entitlement scandal, to come in here talking about entitlements. Sorry, that's what we assume this chamber is for, is to establish an independent parliamentary advisor, effectively an integrity commissioner for MPs. So we were talking before about that grade between legitimate use of entitlements. I was criticised, for example, in the West Australian for visiting a uranium drill site, taking a charter up to the Lake Way uranium drill site just out the back of Wiluna. It's about 1,000 k's from Perth. The Aboriginal mob up in the goldfields, the northeast goldfields, who are really concerned about what a uranium mine and a lake bed would mean for country and culture up in that part of the world. I guess I could have rung them and said, come to Fremantle. I chose to go to them. I would consider that legitimate use of a charter entitlement. It is expensive because WA is larger than Western Europe. I would consider that a legitimate entitlement. And most of us, quite frankly, use the entitlements legitimately as far as I'm concerned. To the grey areas where it's actually a question of interpretation, and I think all of us have probably at one time or another would have really appreciated the opportunity to pick up the phone and say, I'm proposing to do this. Is this within entitlement or not? We all make, even you, Senator McDonald, nobody's accusing you of rorting entitlements, but wouldn't it have been good on some occasions to say, is this within entitlement or not? I'm not sure. And then you can, oh, you're above all of us, Senator McDonald. So unimpeachable.
Order.
It's just wonderful.
Order. I'd ask senators to direct their contributions through the chair.
I shouldn't take the bait. So part of it is around interpretation, and then some of it is actually about straightforward integrity. As far as I'm concerned, flying yourself like Cruella de Vil into a Liberal Party fundraiser, you shouldn't need to pick up the phone to ask whether that's okay. That's just completely not okay. That is about tightening up the entitlement system to make those things just basically off limits. But then I think for the grey area, we would all appreciate the ability to ring somebody up to support MPs and to support staff in particular on making those judgment calls, because we are employed by taxpayers, a lot of them who are struggling under what's happening in the economy at the moment, and the last thing they want to see here is the kind of flagrant abuse that's been in the papers and on the front pages in the last couple of weeks. So we think this is a relatively uncontroversial bill. This is not a stunt. This is about bringing forward a matter that I would have thought most people would intrinsically be in support of, complete that gap in the institutional architecture. Everybody else, no matter how flawed or how much you could critique how the anti-corruption bodies around the country have run in practice, you've seen continual amendments. Premier Baird is proposing amendments to ICAC even as we speak. They have to keep track with custom and practice and corruption, quite frankly. But for us to complete that gap in the architecture and not to hold the conceit that we are above all of that, the best way to keep us above all of that is to have a watchdog on the beat, not just around the areas of ambiguity, but around the areas, quite simply, of criminal conduct and corruption. I don't think we should assume that this institution is necessarily somehow above the fray of human conduct that occurs and that requires those checks and balances and those accountability mechanisms in every other tier of society where people exercise power in the public trust or enormous budgets. We're not seeking to override state and territory anti-corruption bodies, we're seeking to learn from them. If there are other offers, and I guess I would particularly address these comments to the opposition, who haven't ruled it out but showing no interest at all in doing anything with these ideas, if you think this can be improved, if you think there are better ways of going about it, either come at us with amendments, put your own bill into the field announce something, anything, but sitting on the fence, given what people have been put through with Ms Bishop's kind of tip of the iceberg scandal over the last couple of weeks. Surely now is the time to come forward and finish the job. I thank the chamber.
Senator Lyons, Senator McDonald.
Well, Mr Acting Deputy President, I did want to say a few words, but
Senator McDonald, you've already contributed to this debate, so unless you're raising on a point of order.
No, well, I was just going to blast forth, Mr Deputy President. I think Senator Ludlam is giving me leave to speak a second time.
He may like to, but I'm not going to give it to you. So, Senator Lyons.